Superliminal is a game where a 10-second clip should tell you almost everything you need to know about it, and if you're familiar with the first-person puzzle game genre, that clip will probably get your mind racing with possibilities. This is more or less exactly what happened to me. When I first saw footage of the game, I think in a promotional trailer sometime before release, I thought it looked like an innovative new idea and wishlisted it, although that doesn't exactly put the game in a secret club. A lot of the hype around the game was based on comparison to a certain other first-person puzzle game. I'm sure you can guess which one, but I'll get to that later. When I finally got around to playing Superliminal, about a year after its release, however, it left me feeling disappointed. First off, the game is short, only 2 or 3 hours from start to end. There's a challenge mode that kept me playing for a couple of hours longer, but that's a whole other thing, which I'll also get to later. The short length of the game wouldn't be a problem by itself, but my second major criticism is with the puzzles. Later in this video, I'm going to spoil almost every puzzle in the game. But how can that be, I hear you ask, when this video is such an easily digestible length? Well, it's simple. The game has hardly any puzzles, and what puzzles it does have are trivially easy and often reused multiple times. In fact, if you watch the official trailers for the game on its Steam page, then you're already spoiling a good chunk of the game for yourself. Okay, so this is all sounding pretty negative so far, but I didn't go to the effort of making this video just to complain about a game I don't like. There are some genuinely inventive ideas in Superliminal, and some mind-bending moments that deserve to be hidden behind a spoiler warning. There's an idea running throughout Superliminal that perception is reality, and naturally almost every trick or puzzle solution you come across in the game revolves around the manipulation of perspective in some way. You may have noticed that I put trick and puzzle solution on equal footing in that sentence, and the reason I did that is because a lot of the content in Superliminal walks a very fine line between what, in my opinion, does and doesn't count as a puzzle. I'll try to convince you of that later in the video when I can start showing some examples. While I have more than my fair share of criticism for Superliminal, I do still think that it's original enough to be worth your time, and that it's worth going in unspoiled so that you can experience a few surprising moments for yourself. The game has some truly interesting tricks up its sleeve, and while I think that the game as a whole ends up being vastly more style than substance, your mileage may vary. So consider this your final spoiler warning. Stop the video here and come back later if you have any intention of playing the game for yourself. Okay, let's start by examining what the perspective-based mechanics of Superliminal actually look like in action. The first room in the game is a sandbox with a ton of different items to play around with, and you can spend a few enjoyable minutes here testing the limits, large and small, of the game's main mechanic. You can pick up most of the objects in the room, but as you move them around they always assume the biggest size possible from your current perspective. It's like that old question of whether an object is really close and small, or really big and far away, but turned into a game mechanic. The exact way this works can be kind of difficult to wrap your head around at first, especially because your proximity to an object when you pick it up affects the perspective as well. Standing closer means that the object will take up more screen space and thus appear bigger, and it will continue to take up that same amount of screen space when it's picked up and when it's released. Standing far away will make an object seem smaller and take up less screen space. When you're satisfied you've figured out how it works and you're ready to leave, it's no great challenge to see that you need to stack items to reach the exit in the wall. But hey, it's the first room in the game, so it was mostly a place to experiment with the new mechanic. After this room, we'll start coming up against some real puzzles. Which means that now would be a great time for me to cut in with a discussion about what a puzzle really is. The basic concept behind a puzzle is that the player has some factors or variables that they can manipulate, and they need to get those variables into the right order or the right place or whatever it may be. It's important that the player knows immediately what the goal of the puzzle is, otherwise they'll have no idea what they should be aiming to do with the variables at their disposal. A good puzzle shouldn't leave you in any doubt about what you're supposed to be doing, only in how you're going to do it. If you don't know or understand what your goal is, then it's impossible to act with intention and you're just smashing jigsaw pieces together. Let's use Stephen's sausage roll as an example here. You can move your character around, and you can move sausages by pushing them with your character or your fork. These are the variables at the player's disposal: the position of the character and the position of the sausages. This is fine so far, but the puzzle still needs to have a goal. This could be something as simple as getting the player character to a certain spot, or rolling the sausages to a certain spot, as in many classic Sokoban-style block-pushing games. In the case of Steven's sausage roll, however, the goal also adds a new variable to consider. The sausages need to be cooked by rolling them over these grills, giving the player a third variable they need to manipulate: the state of the sausages. The puzzle in each level becomes how to manipulate the variables of character position and sausage position in order to change the third variable, sausage state, from raw to cooked. The variables that a player is able to manipulate then are the absolute basic building blocks of any puzzle's design, and this can be applied to any puzzle game. They can be rearranged and combined in different ways to create a huge variety of challenges and scenarios. The shape of the level will place limitations on the movement options available to the player. The number of sausages, or the number or the placement of grills in the level, will also affect how much freedom the player has to manipulate the level's variables. In fact, much of the challenge of the game's puzzles comes from complications that remove options from the player. If levels had an infinite size, then many puzzles would become effortless to complete, but when parts of the level are taken away, it becomes much harder to maneuver the character and the sausages, reducing the number of possible ways to move them onto the grill. Generally, this number gets reduced to 1, and the challenge of each puzzle is to find the only solution that's still possible, given all of the restrictions and complications in place. In some levels, even the goal itself can change which variables the player needs to pay attention to. Once all the sausages are cooked, there actually is an additional goal to maneuver the character into the level exit, but in most cases this is trivial to achieve. In some puzzles, however, this is flipped on its head to create a gotcha moment and change the variable that the player needs to pay attention to. Since getting to the exit is so trivial in most levels, the player will likely fall into the habit of taking for granted that exiting will be easy once all of the sausages have been cooked, meaning it will be a surprise when they come across a level where the exit is in a devious spot that can't be accessed if the sausages have been cooked in a certain way. This means that suddenly, the most important variable in this puzzle isn't the state of the sausages, but the position of the sausages. And in effect, the puzzle becomes not "how do I cook these sausages," which is trivial to accomplish, but "how do I cook these sausages while still leaving a clear path to the exit?" By now I think I've made my point that a lot of complexity and variety can emerge from thinking about puzzle design this way. Okay, I know I've just spent way too long talking about the wrong puzzle game, and I realise that the last few minutes have been ridiculously abstract and technical, but I've just set up what I believe is a useful framework for thinking about what a puzzle really is, and when we apply this framework to Superliminal later, the results should speak for themselves. So, the first real puzzle room in Superliminal asks you to put this block on a button and then use it to climb to the exit. It's still early in the game, so it's fair enough that the first puzzle to introduce buttons is a simple one. In addition to that, we're being taught that items can be used for multiple purposes, so it's excusable that the whole climb objects to exit the room thing is reused from the previous room. In any case, I hope you like it, because you're going to be seeing it a lot. Take a drink every time it happens. On your way to the next puzzle, you'll probably be surprised by this optical illusion, the first of many gotcha moments in Superliminal. I'm sorry to keep doing this, but I have more to say about these later. The actual next puzzle involves putting an object on a button again. The one after that involves changing the size of an object and climbing it to reach an exit in the wall. Next, you need to change the size of an object to make it small enough to push this button, and then you need to put an object on a button again. The next puzzle might stop you in your tracks for a second, until you look up and realise that there's a gap above the wall. Then you drop an object onto a button again. This pattern of having to notice or realise something before carrying out a trivial solution is going to appear quite a few times as we get further into the game. In its more extreme form, closer to the end of Superliminal, that moment of realisation is itself the entire solution to some puzzles, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The final puzzle of the first chapter asks you to change the size of an object so that you can put it on 2 buttons at once. That brings us to the end of chapter 1, so let's take stock here and try applying that framework I laid out earlier to analyze the puzzles of Superliminal so far. The variables that the player is able to manipulate are the position of the player character themselves, and the position and size of objects. The goal in each puzzle is to move yourself to the level exit, which is never in any doubt, and that's a good thing. If you think back to what I said before, what you're supposed to do should be easy to understand. The puzzle should come from figuring out how to do it. Unfortunately, in most puzzles of Superliminal so far, the solutions have been trivially easy to see. If you have a good grasp on the way the size changing mechanic works, then none of the puzzles from this first chapter will challenge you. You may need to readjust the size or position of an object once or twice to get it just right, but the how of getting to the level exit is generally just as easy to see as the what. First you see the exit in the wall, then you see the only interactable object in the room, and you immediately know you need to enlarge it and climb to the exit. There's just one exception to this in the final puzzle of the chapter, which asks you to put an object on 2 buttons at once. I actually like this puzzle because it builds on what's come before, namely the lessons that objects can press buttons and that they can be used to do multiple things. You're faced with a similar setup to the previous bunch of puzzles, but with an additional complication in a second button that needs to be pressed. Since you're used to using objects to press only one button, the puzzle requires a leap in logic to figure out that you can manipulate another variable, the size of the object, to make it big enough to push both buttons at once. This was the first puzzle in Superliminal that forced me to think for a minute before realizing the solution. Alright, so the puzzles from this first chapter have been simple and fairly repetitive, but now that the game has asked us to prove our understanding of these simple concepts, things will get more complicated from here, right? Let's check out a few puzzles from later chapters. Here's one from chapter 2, where you have to use the only interactable object to climb to the exit. Here's one from chapter 3, where you have to use the only interactable object to climb to the exit. Here's one from chapter 5, where you have to use the only interactable object to climb to the exit. Here's one from chapter 7, where you have to use the only interactable object to climb to the exit. Here's the very last puzzle in the game, and I wish I was joking here, where you have to use the only interactable objects to climb to the exit. Throughout the entire game, the exact same puzzle is presented again and again, and by the end it feels borderline insulting to be faced with the same scenario for the 12th time. There are a few reasons why this is boring. Firstly and most obviously because it's repetitive, and repetition is boring. But even if it wasn't reused so many times across the game, I would still call this puzzle boring because of the second reason. A lack of ambiguity, or in other words, a lack of variables in the puzzle. When a room has only one object that can be interacted with, one variable that can be manipulated, it's trivially easy for the player to immediately see what needs to be done to reach the goal. The only meaningful things I can do in this room are make the object bigger or make the object smaller, and it's just obvious to see that I need to make it bigger to reach the goal. That first room back in chapter 1 that has all the objects to experiment with is the only room with this many variables in the entire game. No other room even comes close to approaching this level of complexity, and as a result, almost every puzzle solution in the game is immediately obvious the instant you walk into the room. To my mind, their trivial nature means that these rooms are seriously stretching the limits of what makes something a puzzle. Compared to this sausage tower puzzle from Steven's Sausage Roll, there's a huge number of variables here, and a lot of ambiguity about where you should even begin. The possibilities are actually quite overwhelming when you see it for the first time on a first playthrough. Now, you may have been thinking to yourself a second ago that the extra objects in the first room of Superliminal don't make the solution of climbing to the exit any more difficult. If anything, it might actually make it easier, at least in execution. That definitely is the case, and the vast majority of the objects can be completely ignored because the goal of the puzzle is so easy to accomplish. In almost every puzzle, the goal is as simple as reaching the level exit, and complications like buttons barely show up anymore after the first chapter. This lack of complications is the third reason the puzzles of Superliminal are boring. I would define those complications as variables that affect other variables. For example, an object placed on a button, which opens a door and increases the size of the space you can move around. or the 2 buttons 1 object puzzle from the end of chapter 1, where placing the object on one button prevents you from being able to place it on the other button, until you realize you can make it big enough to cover both. When a puzzle doesn't have any complications like this, and can be solved pretty much the instant you see it, well, it's boring. Even if you were going through the game with your eyes closed, paying 0 attention to anything, and somehow didn't solve the puzzle the second you walked into the room, you could still solve it just as quickly by brute force trial and error. First try making the object small, and then big, and see which one gets you to the exit. I hope I've proven by now just how uninteresting the core puzzles of Superliminal are, but in case you're still not convinced, just take a look at the game's own challenge mode, which shows that almost every puzzle can be completed in 1 or 2 moves. I'm not exactly sure what possessed the developers to include this mode, because it completely lays bare just how basic these puzzles are. I wonder if there was some other first-person puzzle game they were trying to emulate. If you ignored my spoiler warning earlier and you're watching this video despite not having played the game, then you might be thinking that the simplicity and repetition of Superliminal's puzzles must be an inevitable consequence of its perspective-based, size-changing main mechanic. After all, how much complexity can you really get out of just making objects bigger and smaller? I've grappled with this question a bit myself, and I'll try to answer it as much as it can be answered later on. If you have played Superliminal though, you already know that this is not quite the full story. There are a few chapters in the game, and even a few individual puzzle rooms, that introduce entirely new mechanics, generally still based around perception and perspective, but almost all of these mechanics are discarded immediately after being taught to the player, and never even get a chance to ramp up the complexity or challenge. In order to make sense of all that, however, we first need to zoom out a bit further. I hope you enjoyed that long-winded theoretical section about what makes a puzzle, because I'm about to go one level deeper and ask what makes a puzzle game. Obviously, you could think about it as a series of puzzles that follow the framework I laid out earlier, but I think there's more to it than that. It's very rare to see a game with a sequence of unrelated puzzles, unless you want to count point-and-click adventure games. That kind of game does ask the player to perform logical problem-solving, but stands as a genre justifiably distinct from pure puzzle games, and not just because they tend to focus more on story and characters. Almost every pure puzzle game I can think of features an escalating level of challenge and complexity, with later puzzles building on the mechanics of the ones that came before. Generally speaking, it's a safe bet that any rules you learn in Puzzle 1 will still be relevant in Puzzle 21. In this way, playing through a puzzle game is almost like learning a language, with your vocabulary constantly expanding as new concepts and mechanics are introduced. As an example, let's take a look at Portal, a game that's taken on an almost mythical significance in the world of first-person puzzlers. To its credit though, it's easy to see why, and it's hard to deny that Portal pretty much wrote the rulebook for the structure, if not the content, of later games in the genre. Portal found such an elegant solution to the problem of how to link together a string of puzzles into a cohesive and consistent narrative that it's more or less become the template that every game copies from. The massive appeal and massive success of Portal has cast a long shadow over the first-person puzzle genre, and though it may seem unfair to put Superliminal next to such a groundbreaking classic, well, it's not like they aren't inviting the comparison. So with all that said, how does Portal's structure help to guide the player along its difficulty curve and teach them the logical language they need to solve each level? In other words, how does Portal succeed as a puzzle game? Almost every chamber in Portal, at least for the first half, leaves you with some new knowledge about the rules of the world, some new puzzle vocabulary. You can't leave the room until you've learned the lesson that it's trying to teach you, because solving the puzzle and reaching the exit involves using that new piece of knowledge. The very first room has these fixed portals, which causes you to see yourself through them and realize how they connect and move you through space. The very next room teaches you that boxes can be used to press buttons. In the following rooms, you're taught that portals can be moved, then tested on that as you're given the ability to place portals of your own, though just of one colour for now. You learn that portals go both ways, that boxes can go through portals too, and that portals can be placed on floors and ceilings. In all of these cases, once the game has made sure you have these rules in your vocabulary by forcing you to use them, they can be taken for granted for the remainder of the game. The designers know that boxes press buttons, so they can shift the puzzle up one level and make it about how exactly you're going to get a box onto that button. When you see this button in chamber 18 and then enter the room behind it and see the cube across the chasm, you should immediately know that your goal is to fetch that cube and bring it back to the button. Some teaching moments in Portal are made more obvious by stripping away options, like this room designed to teach you about the conservation of momentum through portals. The only surfaces in this room that can hold a portal are the ones you need to use to solve it. A far cry from the majority of other rooms which have a lot of bare space, and therefore a lot of ambiguity about which portal placements are necessary for a solution. That ambiguity is an essential part of what makes a challenging puzzle in the first place, but these teaching moments exist not to challenge you, only to make sure you understand a new mechanic. They're not about tweaking variables to get to a goal state, as most puzzles are. They're about learning a new variable, momentum in the case of this room in Portal. I'd go as far as to say that these teaching moments aren't really puzzles, they're just about giving you the vocabulary you'll be needing for later puzzles. As you play, you will internalize these rules of the game's puzzle logic, even ones that are not explicitly taught. For instance, you'll begin to get a feel for which potential portal placements are and are not likely to be part of a solution. If you see a sloped surface, you might start keeping an eye out for a long drop you can use to launch yourself from. For a comparable example from Steven's sausage roll, you'll quickly learn for yourself in the first area not to move raw sausages over the edge of a level because they can't be retrieved once you've done so. When you realize this, it's a rule you can hold onto for the entirety of the game, and it's something you taught yourself. Of course, a good puzzle game also needs to actually ramp up the complexity for later puzzles and make you use what you've learned. Take another look at this room with the cube that we want. You need to show your understanding of turrets, energy pellets, and conserving momentum to cross large gaps in order to achieve your goal. If we didn't already know how all of these things worked, then this chamber would seem completely overwhelming, kind of like that sausage tower from Steven's sausage roll, which may or may not be the first time you've ever seen sausages stacked on top of each other in that game. Even there, however, there's a clue for what you should be trying to do in the shape of the grills, which you may have learned to spot if you were paying attention in the first area of the game. Another way of testing the player's understanding of puzzle concepts is by showing them a familiar scenario with a twist and asking them to work around it. This puzzle appears in Portal not long after you've been taught about how momentum works when travelling through portals, and it has a simple enough solution. A few chambers later, the same setup appears with a slight difference. Certain surfaces have been changed to prevent the placement of portals. Because you remember the earlier puzzle, you know that you need to get enough momentum to launch yourself over the barrier, but the puzzle this time is shifted up a level, as you have to work out how to generate that momentum when the usual trick won't work. The answer, by the way, lies in this side room, where there's a small drop onto a portalable surface, which will launch you halfway towards the barrier and off the portal blocking surface. So I think now we have something of a framework for what makes a puzzle game to go along with our framework for what makes a puzzle. If a puzzle is about asking a player to manipulate certain variables to reach a predefined goal state, then a puzzle game as a whole is about introducing a player to those variables one by one, making sure that they understand them, before dropping them into a room where that understanding will be tested with a puzzle. Everything you learn, every trick you add to your vocabulary should remain relevant and consistent throughout the game, but this also means that things need to get progressively more complex as the game goes on in order to stay interesting, with new rules regularly being added and variables being combined to create new scenarios. Each puzzle is a balancing act between what you already know and what the puzzle has to teach you. If Portal stopped adding new rules after 5 chambers, then the whole game would just involve putting a box on a button and walking through the exit. Can you imagine how boring that would be, a puzzle game where every single solution looked exactly the same? Now let's run through a few chapters of Superliminal and see how it looks when examined through this framework. First, there are the murals that appear in Chapter 2, which require you to stand in a certain spot to reveal an object which you can then pluck out of thin air and place where you need it. No prizes for guessing what you need to do with the objects created in this way. I could forgive this if it only happened in an introductory puzzle to teach you how the trick works, but in every single puzzle of this chapter that uses this mechanic, you just use the object to climb to the exit. Again. The third chapter has a single room that contains these sliding columns, and is one of the rare puzzles that actually does require a bit of problem solving to figure out. You need to lower one column to get it out of the way of another one, so that you can, you guessed it, climb to the exit. It's not much, but it's something. The rest of the chapter consists of the exact same climbing puzzle I've already spent 20 minutes complaining about, except sometimes the boxes explode or do other weird stuff. Okay then. The fourth chapter revolves around light, which means that most of its puzzles involve even fewer variables for the player to manipulate than usual, since they're not about objects and mostly just need you to move yourself until you see the correct perspective to find the exit. This is where the game really starts to stretch the definition of puzzle. When crossing this plank bridge, for example, the light below you is placed just precisely to trick you into taking a wrong path at first, before you eventually hit a dead end and realise your mistake. I think it's quite telling that the challenge mode for this chapter isn't split into separate puzzles, because there aren't any, and instead asks you to complete the whole chapter with only 2 moves, a trivially easy task which is made only slightly taxing by the game tricking you with these tanks at the beginning that can be passed without actually moving them. Chapter 5 brings in a strange new mechanic that creates a duplicate of objects when you grab them. It's introduced with a fairly interesting teaching moment that has you turning a door into some stairs, in a slight twist on that ubiquitous climbing puzzle, and then it makes you do a regular climbing puzzle. If this repetition is annoying you, by the way, then imagine how it feels to play the game. To its credit, the game finally does something new with one of its mechanics and reverses the usual button puzzle by asking you to find a way to remove an object from a button by bashing it with a massive copy of itself. And then the chapter ends with another climbing puzzle. So, what's wrong with all this? Why are these sequences of puzzles, and Superliminal as a whole, so unsatisfying to play through? It's because the mechanics that are introduced throughout the game are never expanded upon past a basic teaching phase. Almost every puzzle in Superliminal is just like that one from Portal that teaches you about conservation of momentum. That puzzle in Portal is deliberately simplified because it's not really about challenging you, it's about teaching you a rule that you'll need to use in later, more complex puzzles. In Superliminal, those complex puzzles never come. There are no tricks to learn and make use of, like avoiding pushing sausages over the edge in Steven's sausage roll, and there's no consistency or escalation of rules between puzzles. In fact, when Chapter 5 throws everything out and completely changes the rule set, you can't rely on anything you've learned previously, and more or less have to start from scratch, which in my book is the antithesis of what makes a puzzle game work. So now I think it's time to address the giant chess piece in the room, of whether or not it was inevitable that Superliminal's puzzles would be this simple and repetitive. At first glance, it seems like maybe the main mechanic, changing the size of objects, doesn't actually have a lot of meat to it in terms of puzzle potential. As I said earlier, when the only way you can interact with a puzzle is by making an object smaller or larger, the solution will either be obvious the instant you see the puzzle, or you have a 50-50 chance of guessing it. Compare that to Portal, which has a lot of variability in where you can place portals, and therefore a lot of ambiguity about which placements might be relevant to a potential solution. This means that puzzles in Portal can't be brute forced by random guessing. They're complex enough that you need to understand why the solution works in order to discover it. There are simply too many options for trial and error to be viable in Portal, but in Superliminal, the mechanic is too simple for this to be the case. Or is it? Well, yeah, it kind of is, at least in its current form. But did it have to be? I'm not so sure. Even before we start adding new mechanics like the murals, I think there's much more potential in the manipulation of objects as seen in Chapter 1. I'm just throwing this out there, I don't want to go too crazy, but how about a puzzle that asks you to build a structure other than a stairway to the exit? Just an idea. And while I'm at it, the size of the room you're in generally creates a hard limit on how big you can make an object. So how about a puzzle inside a room with a low ceiling, or where you can only change the size of objects from a certain viewpoint? Maybe you could make a puzzle out of a hole in the wall that needs to be filled using a certain number of shapes. What about a puzzle involving weight, where you need to resize objects to balance some scales, or make a cube of foam weigh the same as a cube of steel? I can't show any footage for these ideas because of course the game never does anything like this. I'm not trying to claim that these ideas are amazing, but they are something, where currently Superliminal has nothing. There was one point in the game where I entered a new room and noticed a reflective surface on the wall. It turned out not to be relevant in that puzzle, but from that point on I kept my eye on every reflective surface I came across, convinced that the game's theme of perspective would eventually lead to a puzzle involving reflecting mirrors, waiting for the time I would need to use one in a solution. That time never came. Eventually I realized that the reflections aren't actually rendered in real time, so it wasn't even possible for them to be relevant to puzzles. I couldn't care less about this as a graphical shortcoming, it's the missed puzzle potential that I find really disappointing. And I could just keep going. Perhaps the chapter with the biggest missed potential is the 6th, which I have deliberately avoided mentioning until now. This chapter is the closest the game comes to actually featuring progression on an idea, and it involves changing the size of yourself by manipulating doorways and other objects that you can walk inside, which is by far the most interesting mechanic that gets introduced in the game. Let's see if it goes anywhere. First you enlarge a house so that you can get inside it, then make it even bigger to get through a small doorway. This is a pretty strong start, and a sensible teaching moment for a new mechanic, showing you that the size of the house's exterior affects the size of the interior. Next is a puzzle where you embiggen a fan until it's large enough to blow down this Jenga tower, which is another really intriguing idea even if the puzzle is trivial to complete. So now that we've been introduced to both of these ideas, changing your own size and objects that generate wind, surely we're about to see them combined into a challenging and interesting puzzle. Maybe one that asks you to make yourself small enough to be blown across the room by a fan. Well, first of course you have to get through this bullshit room that just makes you hunt around for the one interactable object so that you can enlarge it and walk through. This isn't even a puzzle, so I'm just ignoring it. Finally, Superliminal starts to look like a real puzzle game when it offers the player an advancement on an idea in this next puzzle, which asks you to resize and move a bouncy castle so that you can climb inside and through this door, bringing you to another vantage point where you can relocate the castle next to the exit, only visible from this spot. To my memory, this is the single most complex puzzle in the game, and is also the one that takes the highest amount of moves to complete, although that amount is still only 3. You're tested on your understanding of the game's main resizing mechanic, of your placement of objects, and of the effect that resizing and moving doorways can have. In this case, very similar to Portals, funnily enough for one of the only legitimate puzzles in the game. All of these rules have been introduced to you earlier in the game, but here they're actually combined into one scenario that requires a bit of thinking about how each variable should be manipulated. The next and final puzzle of this chapter impresses with its scale, and entering its room was one of the more breathtaking moments I experienced when playing Superliminal for the first time. Unfortunately, the puzzle itself doesn't stick the landing. In this gigantic chamber, you have 2 connected doorways that you can resize however you like. I was so intrigued by the idea of 2 doors connected in this way that I immediately started playing around with them without even thinking to look for the exit. I tried making one door small, walked into the other one, and had an audible "holy shit" moment when I stepped out into the enormous space waiting on the other side. I happily spent a minute or 2 here travelling back and forth through the looking glass until I realised I should be looking for the way out, and was met with the usual disappointment when I saw that the solution was just as simple as all the others before it. As in so many other puzzles, the solution can be found in exactly one move and is effortless to figure out, as if the game is constantly in a hurry to shuffle you into the next room. I realised on a subsequent playthrough that you can even take both doors with you outside the starting chamber to play with your size in the outside room as well, which felt like an incredible discovery, but of course was meaningless as far as puzzles were concerned. This room that feels so full of possibilities, yet goes absolutely nowhere, ended up being one of the most memorable in the game for me, purely because of this massive missed potential. Oh yeah, and you remember the wind mechanic? Yeah, it never shows up again. I think I can pretty much rest my case here for why Superliminal fails as a puzzle game. It simply isn't interested in testing you or asking you to think about any of its mechanics. It just wants to show them off to you and make you say, ooh, ah, like a tourist on a bus. On the very rare occasions the game actually lets you loose to experiment and play with a mechanic, there's no reward or incentive to do so, and you'll soon be shoved back on the bus and told to keep your arms inside. So, having torn Superliminal to shreds and set fire to it, I could just end the video here, safe in the knowledge that a bad puzzle game will never come out again now that I've thoroughly taken one apart to figure out what makes and breaks them. But the thing is that Superliminal fails so spectacularly, wastes so much potential, and misses so many obvious avenues for puzzle designs that it can only have been a deliberate choice by the developers. I'm left with no choice but to conclude that Superliminal was never really about the puzzles anyway, and that the game's whistle-stop tour through a string of different concepts was actually, you know, your average puzzle game teaches you rules which you can then take for granted for the remainder of the game. Every time you encounter a new puzzle, you can bring with you a set of assumptions about how the puzzle will work, based on what you've learned from previous puzzles. Puzzle games rely on these kinds of assumptions to work. It's the only way to ensure that later puzzles can build on the challenge of earlier ones to establish a difficulty curve. But what if the designers of a puzzle game were not interested in establishing a difficulty curve, building on previous challenges, or following a template that, to be honest, has been done to death by countless other games? What if instead their goal was to exploit these assumptions, and use them to surprise players by pulling the rug from under them? At many points throughout Superliminal, you'll come across these gotcha moments, where something that you took for granted is suddenly thrown into a new light and completely recontextualized. You think you know what you're looking at, then get an unexpected shock when you realize that your assumption was completely wrong. The game seems to revel in these moments, and there is a certain joy in experiencing these perspective tricks for yourself. They're surprising, intriguing, and might even make you laugh, and I'd go as far as to say they're the only part of the game that I think makes a spoiler warning justified. I think they mostly speak for themselves and don't require much commentary, but the fact that these tricks are used so frequently throughout the game makes them one of the only consistent things about playing Superliminal, which I don't think is a coincidence. This one is my favourite, by the way. Holy shit. But there's a little more to this theme of discovering new perspectives in Superliminal than just a few optical illusions. There are certain points where it's baked into the gameplay itself. I would love to have said puzzles in that sentence instead of gameplay, but by the time the game is using these kinds of tricks in interactive ways, there's almost nothing resembling a puzzle to be found. I know that sounds like a bold claim, so I want to justify it. Take this puzzle from near the end of Chapter 7, close to the end of the game. At a glance, it's no more complicated than putting an object on the button and leaving through the open door. When you try it, however, this happens. The object turns into a mural on the wall. It's then trivial to grab the other object and place it on the button to leave. This room will probably surprise you and might even amuse you, but it's not a puzzle. To drive this point home, if you play through this room on challenge mode, then it asks you to complete it in only one move, meaning you just have to ignore the trick object and go straight for the other one. Maybe you think I'm being too harsh in saying that these aren't puzzles. Well, let's take a look at this room from near the very end of Superliminal. This room was the only time the game had me feeling seriously stuck. There doesn't seem to be any apparent goal or interactable objects, so I wandered around this room again and again, jumping on the scenery, trying to climb for an exit, which the game taught me to do, peering into every corner to look for something interactable, something the game also taught me to do. Eventually, when I was this close to cracking and looking up a walkthrough, I noticed this exit sign, hidden in the shadows and only visible from a certain angle. And I didn't feel happy, or satisfied, or like I'd accomplished anything. I just thought, how the fuck was I supposed to know that? Even at a casual glance, I think it's obvious that this room doesn't constitute a puzzle. And as I'm sure you can tell from the length of the videos on my channel, being concise is very important to me, so I'll just give 3 reasons why. Firstly, there's no clear goal or win state when you enter the room, which means that you have no idea what you're even supposed to be trying to do, and no idea where to begin looking. Second, there are no variables to manipulate besides your own location, so you have nothing to focus your attention on, and without that guidance will most likely just start wandering around in circles looking for some kind of interactable, like I did. Third, this room doesn't teach you anything that will be useful in later scenarios. It doesn't challenge you to work anything out or introduce any concepts that will be built upon later, unless you count being on the lookout for time-wasting bullshit as a concept, in which case it prepares you very well for the rest of the game. This is not a room that can be solved logically. The exit can only be found by random chance, when you happen to be standing in the right spot and facing the right way. This is completely unfair, it has absolutely no place in a puzzle game, and it's not a puzzle, it's just not. Just a few rooms later, you're put through a similar ordeal when you find yourself in this room with 4 walls and a corridor at each end, but the corridors both seem to loop around and put you back into the same room. Once again, there's no clear goal for what you're supposed to be doing, and no variable to manipulate besides your own position. The solution, it turns out, is to realize that the white walls are actually not walls at all, and can be walked through to find the hidden exit. This room is another one that can't be solved by logical deduction. The way to complete it is to accidentally stumble into the answer, and because of that I have to say again, this is not a puzzle. Now here's where you might be crying out to say that it's not the point of this room to offer you a puzzle that can be solved by logic. The point is to make you realize that your assumptions were holding you back, and that freeing yourself of them is the only way to move forward. Just like the gotcha moments spread throughout the game, the purpose is to shake you out of taking things for granted and get you looking at things in a different way. I can't deny that this plays almost perfectly into the game's themes of challenging assumptions and adopting new perspectives, but what I can say is this: it's not satisfying to play. The problem with asking the player to realize something they didn't know before in order to leave a level is that when they finally do have that realization, they're gonna say, how the fuck was I supposed to know that? Which is not something you want players of your game to be saying, ever. Working out the solution to a puzzle in Portal, or in Steven's Sausage Roll, or basically any puzzle game other than this one, is satisfying because you need to demonstrate your understanding of the game's mechanics by using logic and problem-solving skills to manipulate the puzzle's variables in just the right way to succeed. These chambers near the end of Superliminal make a mockery of that by forcing you to walk around like an idiot until you stumble into the exit. But even if you look back through the rest of the game, there's an embarrassingly small number of rooms that actually do ask you to demonstrate any kind of understanding of the game's mechanics, which change so often throughout the game anyway that there's barely anything consistent that you even could be challenged on. In the end, I have to respect Superliminal for its fanatical commitment to its core philosophical idea, even if it had to tank its status as a puzzle game to make it happen. The idea that perceiving is a creative act that can change the world around you is a fascinating one to explore in a game, and that 10-second clip I started this video with still remains a compelling introduction to the concept. Unfortunately, when it comes to being a satisfying puzzle game, I was right when I said that those 10 seconds showed you everything you need to know about Superliminal, because those 10 seconds are all there is.